A little girl dragged the mountain man to an abandoned cabin, and what was inside changed everything. Snow whips across the ridge. A lonely cabin stands silent, its roof half fallen, its windows black. The gruff mountain man thinks it's just another ruin, until the child pushes open the door. On the hearth lies a Bible, deeds, and a map pointing to a spring that could save or destroy the whole valley. But word spreads fast. Hoofbeats thunder. A deputy with cold eyes and a railroad boss hungry for land will burn anything to claim that water. The cabin becomes a battleground of faith, fire, and frontier justice. The child clings to hope, whispering prayers in the smoke. The mountain man, scarred by loss, must decide. Will he fight for her future, or let the past bury them both? The church bell tolls. Guns cock in the dark. The spring's promise is life itself. What happens when a forgotten child's inheritance collides with greed, fire, and a man's last chance at redemption? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter wind whipped across Mateo Hale's face as he trudged through knee-deep snow, checking his trapline in the growing storm. His weathered hands, protected only by worn leather gloves, trembled slightly as he discovered yet another empty trap. "Nothing again," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. The solitude of the high country usually brought him peace, but today the emptiness pressed in around him like the heavy gray clouds overhead. The trapline stretched before him, barely visible through the thickening snowfall. Mateo adjusted his wool scarf and pulled his coat tighter, considering turning back. In 15 years of living alone in these mountains, he'd learned to read the weather's moods. This storm had an ugly look about it. A flash of movement caught his eye. Mateo's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his back, but he froze when a small figure burst from the dense pine trees. A child, hardly more than a wisp in ragged clothes, charged straight at him through the deep snow. Before he could step back, tiny hands seized his arm with surprising strength. Mateo found himself staring down into a pair of desperate blue eyes set in a dirt-smudged face. "Please," the girl gasped, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Please, mister, you have to come with me." Mateo tried to gentle his normally gruff voice. "Now hold on there, little one. Where'd you come from? Where's your folks?" Instead of answering, she tugged harder on his arm. "There's no time. The snow's covering everything up. Please, you have to help me find it before it's all buried." Something in her tone, raw fear mixed with determination, stirred memories Mateo usually kept locked away. He looked down at her thin frame, dressed in clothes far too light for the weather. Her dark hair was tangled with pine needles, and her boots were worn nearly through. "Find what?" he asked, but she was already pulling him forward with the single-minded focus of a child on a mission. "This way," she insisted, leading him off the familiar path of his trapline and into the thick timber. Mateo's instincts told him to resist, to turn back toward his cabin before the storm trapped them both. But the girl's grip never loosened, and he found himself following her deeper into the forest. The wind grew fiercer, driving ice crystals against their faces as they pushed through the deepening snow. "Name's Mateo," he offered as they walked. "Mateo Hale. You got a name, child?" "Ava," she answered without looking back, her attention focused on navigating through the trees. "Just a little further, Mr. Hale. It's right past these big cottonwoods." They emerged into a small clearing where a line of massive cottonwood trees had fallen, their ancient trunks forming a tangled barrier. Half hidden behind the fallen giants, Mateo spotted the dark shape of a cabin. Snow had drifted against its walls and partially collapsed roof, suggesting it had stood abandoned for some time. Ava's pace quickened as she led him around the fallen trees. "This was our home," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Mine and Pa's." Mateo studied the cabin with experienced eyes. The log walls were solid enough, though weather had taken its toll. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and through the broken window, he could see snow had blown inside. "Your pa around?" Mateo asked carefully, though he already suspected the answer from her use of "was." Ava's small shoulders slumped. "He's with Jesus now," she said quietly. "But he left something important here, something I have to find." Mateo's heart, long hardened against others' pain, gave an uncomfortable twinge. He knew too well how loss could hollow out a person's insides, leaving nothing but empty spaces where warmth used to be, especially the loss of family. "Let's have a look then," he said, moving past her to push open the creaking door. "But we'll need to make it quick. Storm's getting worse." Inside the cabin was a study in abandonment. A layer of snow dusted everything: the rough-hewn table, the rustic chairs, the cold hearth. Weak light filtered through the holes in the roof, casting gray shadows across the floor. The air held the musty smell of decay and disuse. Ava darted past him, heading straight for the stone fireplace. "Help me look," she said, dropping to her knees beside the hearth. Pa said he put them somewhere safe, somewhere dry. Mateo moved closer, watching as her small hands searched the stones around the fireplace. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Papers," she answered, not pausing in her examination. "Important papers Pa said would protect the spring. And his Bible. He never went anywhere without his Bible." Mateo's interest sharpened at the mention of a spring. Water rights were precious in the valley, often worth more than gold. He joined her search, checking the corners and crevices around the fireplace. "Here!" Ava's excited cry drew his attention. She had discovered a loose stone near the base of the hearth. Behind it was a small cavity, and within that space lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. With trembling fingers, Ava pulled the package out and carefully unwrapped it. Inside, Mateo could see yellowed papers, their edges crisp despite the cabin's dampness. A well-worn Bible lay on top, its leather cover scratched but intact. "Pa's Bible," Ava whispered, running her fingers reverently over the cover. She opened it carefully, revealing spidery handwriting on the flyleaf. "See? It says, 'Property of Thomas Whitcomb.' That's my pa." Mateo leaned closer, examining the other papers. His eyes widened as he recognized legal documents, property deeds, and water rights. There was also a carefully folded map, its creases reinforced with strips of cloth to prevent tearing. "Your pa was Thomas Whitcomb?" Mateo asked, pieces falling into place in his mind. He'd heard rumors about Whitcomb's claim to a spring high in the mountains, but the man had disappeared months ago, and with him, any proof of ownership. Ava nodded, clutching the Bible to her chest. "He always said the spring was God's gift, meant to be shared with everyone, not just the rich folks down in the valley." Her voice grew softer. "But then the fever came, and Pa said I had to hide until it was safe. Until I found someone trustworthy to help." Mateo sat back on his heels, studying the small figure before him. She looked half-starved and exhausted, but her eyes held a strength that spoke of survival against impossible odds. How long had she been alone, hiding in these mountains? How had she managed to stay alive? The wind howled outside, rattling the loose boards of the cabin. Mateo knew they couldn't stay much longer. The storm was building to a fury that would soon make travel impossible. But he couldn't leave this child alone, not with night coming on and temperatures dropping. "We need to get you somewhere warm," he said, standing up. "My cabin's not far, maybe an hour's walk if we hurry." Ava looked up at him, clutching the precious bundle of papers. "Can I trust you, Mr. Hale?" Pa said I had to be sure before I showed anyone the papers. Mateo met her gaze steadily. "I reckon your pa was right about being careful. There's folks who'd do anything to get their hands on water rights." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I can't promise to fix everything, but I give you my word. I'll help you figure out what's right." Something in his tone must have convinced her because Ava nodded and carefully rewrapped the papers in the oilcloth. Mateo helped her secure the bundle inside her worn coat, then led her toward the cabin door. As they stepped back into the swirling snow, Mateo felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. This child's trust was a burden he hadn't sought, but now that it was given, he couldn't ignore it. Her father's papers could change everything in the valley, and there were powerful people who wouldn't want that change. Mateo took Ava's small hand in his as they began the trek through deepening snow. The wind cut through his coat, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind was already working through the implications of what they'd found and what it might mean for both their futures. The papers hidden against Ava's chest carried more than just legal claims. They carried hope for justice, and perhaps something even more precious, the chance for two lonely souls to find family again. The storm howled outside Mateo's cabin, rattling the shutters against their frames. Inside, the warm glow of a coal oil lantern cast dancing shadows on the log walls as Mateo spread the rescued papers across his rough-hewn table. Beside him, Ava stood on tiptoe, her small hands gripping the table's edge as she watched him examine each document. "Pa always kept these safe," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "He said they were more precious than gold." Mateo nodded, carefully unfolding the weathered deed. The paper was yellow with age but had been well preserved, protected from moisture and wear by the oilcloth wrapping. His calloused fingers traced the carefully penned script, noting the official seal in the corner. "Your father was a careful man," Mateo observed, studying Thomas Whitcomb's distinctive mark at the bottom of the deed. "Everything's properly signed and witnessed." Ava's face brightened at the praise of her father. "He taught me my letters using that Bible," she said, reaching for the worn leather book. "We'd read together every night after supper." Mateo watched as she opened the Bible with reverent care. The flyleaf bore a family record in neat handwriting. Thomas Whitcomb, married to Sarah Miller Whitcomb, and their daughter, Ava Grace Whitcomb, born in the spring of 1872. Below were other dates that made Mateo's throat tighten. Sarah Whitcomb died of fever, April 12, 1878. Thomas Whitcomb died of fever, April 15, 1878. "You've been alone since spring?" Mateo asked, his voice rough with disbelief. Ava nodded, her fingers tracing the names in the Bible. "Pa told me to hide in the woods if anything happened to him. Said there were folks who'd try to take advantage if they knew I was by myself." She looked up at Mateo with eyes too old for her young face. "I'm good at hiding. And I learned how to check traps without springing them." Mateo's hands clenched involuntarily. He'd wondered why some of his traps had been emptied these past months. The thought of this child surviving alone, stealing morsels from his traps to stay alive, made his chest ache with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. "Show me the map," he said gruffly, pushing away the emotion. Ava carefully unfolded the creased paper, reinforced at its folds with strips of cloth. The map was detailed, showing the ridge lines and valleys Mateo knew so well. Near the top, a spring was marked with careful precision, along with notes about water flow and seasonal changes. "Pa said the spring never runs dry," Ava explained, her finger tracing the path from the spring down to the valley. "Even in the worst drought, it keeps flowing. That's why he knew it was special, a blessing meant to be shared." Mateo knew the spring she spoke of. He'd come across it in his hunting trips, a clear stream of water bursting from the rocky mountainside. He'd assumed it was unclaimed, like most of the high country water sources. But if Thomas Whitcomb had filed a proper claim, a loud growl from Ava's stomach interrupted his thoughts. The child blushed, wrapping her arms around her middle. "When's the last time you ate proper?" Mateo asked, already moving toward his meager stores. "I found some berries yesterday," Ava answered, "and I had a piece of jerky the day before." Mateo's jaw tightened as he pulled out the last of his salt pork and some dried apples. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He set about preparing a simple meal, heating water for tea, and slicing the pork thin to make it stretch. Ava ate like someone who'd known real hunger, carefully but quickly making sure every crumb was consumed. Mateo found himself pushing more portions her way, his own appetite diminished by the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. As night deepened and the storm showed no signs of letting up, Mateo laid out his bedroll near the fireplace. He offered Ava his only blanket, but she shook her head. Could I sleep close to you?" she asked hesitantly. "Like Pa used to let me when it stormed?" Mateo's heart clenched at the request. How many nights had his own daughter, Sarah, curled against him during storms? The memory of those times, long buried under years of grief, surfaced with surprising clarity. "Come on, then," he said gruffly, lifting the edge of the blanket. Ava settled beside him, her small body curled like a comma against his side. The familiar weight and warmth stirred memories Mateo had thought safely buried. His wife Mary singing their daughter to sleep, the sound of small feet running across wooden floors. the feel of tiny arms wrapped around his neck in trust and love. Sleep eluded him as the storm raged outside. In the darkness, Mateo's mind wandered back to that terrible night 8 years ago, when fire had claimed his family and his faith in one cruel sweep. He'd retreated to the high country afterward, choosing solitude over the risk of caring for anyone again. Now, listening to Ava's steady breathing beside him, Mateo felt something shift in his chest. The wall he'd built around his heart developed a hairline crack, letting in a feeling he'd forgotten existed: hope. Morning brought a temporary lull in the storm. Mateo woke to find Ava already up, trying to restart the fire with small, cold, numbed fingers. He showed her how to lay the kindling properly, guiding her hands as she struck the flint. "We'll need more wood," he said, eyeing his depleting woodpile. "Storm might last another day or two." Together they ventured out into the knee-deep snow. Mateo showed Ava how to test logs for dryness and carry them safely. She worked without complaint, her determination evident in every step through the deep snow. As they stacked the gathered wood inside the cabin, Mateo found himself studying the child. She had Thomas Whitcomb's straight nose and determined chin, but her eyes held a spark of something else, a resilience that spoke of her mother's strength, perhaps. "Those papers," Mateo said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had grown between them. "They could mean trouble. There's powerful men down in the valley who won't take kindly to someone claiming water rights they thought were free for the taking." Ava paused in her wood stacking, meeting his gaze steadily. "Pa said the same thing. That's why he made me promise to be careful who I trusted with the secret." Mateo nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her trust settle more firmly on his shoulders. "Reckon we'll need to look into these claims proper-like. Make sure everything's legal and binding." He hesitated, then added, "And until we do, you'll stay here where it's safe." The smile that broke across Ava's face was like sunshine after rain, warming places in Mateo's heart he'd thought forever frozen. He turned quickly to hide his own expression, busying himself with the fire. "First things first," he said gruffly. "We need to get this cabin properly warm and see about fixing some breakfast. Can't think straight on an empty stomach." As he worked alongside the child, showing her how to bank the fire and heat water for coffee, weak tea for her, Mateo felt the stirring of something he'd long forgotten: purpose. These papers, this child's trust, they were a responsibility he hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. He watched as Ava carefully returned the papers to their oilcloth wrapping, handling them with a reverence that spoke of their importance to her. They weren't just legal documents. They were her heritage, her father's legacy, and perhaps her only chance at a future. The storm outside gathered strength again, but inside the cabin something else was building, a cautious bond between two wounded souls, and the first tentative steps toward healing for both of them. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the storm finally spent. Mateo rose early, checking his supplies while Ava still slept. His line shack, a day's ride through the deep snow, would offer better shelter than this crumbling cabin. He gathered what remained of his provisions and gently woke the child. "Time to move on," he said, watching her rub sleep from her eyes. "Got a proper place up higher. Safer there." Ava nodded, quickly rolling up her father's papers and tucking them inside her worn coat. She moved with the efficiency of someone used to leaving places behind, though her small hands shook slightly from the cold. Outside, Mateo's mule stamped impatiently in the fresh snow. The animal was strong and sure-footed, used to mountain trails, but the going would be slow with two riders. He helped Ava mount, then swung up behind her. "Hold tight to the pommel," he instructed, wrapping his coat around her as best he could. "Trails rough in places." They set out as the sun climbed higher, the mule picking its way carefully through snow-choked paths. Mateo kept them to the timberline where possible, using the trees for shelter against the bitter wind. Ava sat quietly at first, but as the morning wore on, her curiosity got the better of her. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked, her voice carrying back to him. 8 years, Mateo answered shortly, guiding the mule around a fallen pine. "All by yourself?" "Yep." "Don't you get lonely?" Mateo's hands tightened on the reins. "I got used to it." But Ava wasn't deterred by his brief responses. Pa said people weren't meant to be alone. Said it right there in Genesis. Not good for man to be alone. Mateo grunted, uncomfortable with how close her words struck to home. Your pa read the Bible much? Every night, Ava said proudly. Said it was more important than bread. Though, she added thoughtfully, bread's awful important too. Despite himself, Mateo felt a smile tugging at his lips. The child had a way of stating things that cut through his carefully maintained wall of solitude. By midday, both riders and mule needed rest. Mateo found a sheltered spot beneath a stand of thick pines and helped Ava dismount. Her legs were stiff from the cold ride, and she stumbled slightly. Let's get a fire going, he said, noting how she hugged herself for warmth. Mateo cleared snow from a patch of ground while Ava gathered pine needles and small twigs. She watched intently as he built the fire, asking questions about each step. The flames caught quickly, and soon they were huddled close, sharing the last of Mateo's jerky. Were you always a mountain man? Ava asked, warming her hands by the fire. Mateo stared into the flames, weighing his words. No, used to have a ranch down in the valley. What happened to it? Fire took it, he said shortly, along with everything else. Ava was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those two wise eyes. Is that why you came up here? To get away from the memories? Mateo stood abruptly, stamping out the fire. Time to move on. The afternoon passage was slower, the trail steeper. Ava dozed occasionally, leaning back against Mateo's chest. He found himself automatically adjusting his grip to keep her secure, old protective instincts surfacing without his permission. It was nearly sunset when they finally reached his line shack. The sturdy log structure stood against the mountainside, smoke still curling from its stone chimney where he'd banked the fire before leaving 2 days ago. Ava's eyes widened as they entered. It's like a real house, huh? Mateo surveyed his home through her eyes. The pot-bellied stove, the neat stack of split wood, the single bunk with its bear hide blanket, the shelves of preserved food and tools. Simple comforts he'd taken for granted now seemed like luxuries. You've got a stove and everything, Ava marveled, moving closer to its warmth. Pa always wanted to get one, but they cost too dear. Mateo busied himself with starting supper, setting beans to soak and mixing cornmeal for bread. Ava watched every movement, offering to help, but mostly staying out of his way. The familiar routine felt strange with an audience, but not unpleasant. As the beans simmered and the cornbread baked, Ava pulled out her father's Bible. The leather cover was worn smooth with use, its pages dog-eared and marked. Would you read some? She asked hesitantly. Pa always read before supper. Mateo stared at the book, remembering other evenings, other readings. Mary had been the religious one, insisting on daily devotions. After losing her, he'd turned his back on faith entirely. But Ava's hopeful expression wore down his resistance. Just a short bit, he conceded, taking the Bible carefully. The book fell open to a marked passage in Psalms. Mateo's voice, rough from disuse, stumbled over the familiar words. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Ava closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. When he finished, she folded her hands and bowed her head. Dear Lord, she prayed simply, thank you for sending Mr. Mateo to help me, and for this warm place to sleep, and for beans and cornbread. Please help Pa and Ma rest peaceful in heaven, and help Mr. Mateo not be so sad anymore. Amen. Mateo turned quickly to check the beans, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. The child's simple faith, her easy inclusion of him in her prayers, stirred something long buried in his heart. Meanwhile, as darkness settled over the mountains, another scene was unfolding at the abandoned cabin they'd left behind. Jim Tanner, a grizzled trapper working his way through the high country, spotted smoke still rising from the remnants of their fire. Curious about activity in what he'd thought was empty territory, Tanner investigated. The cabin's interior showed signs of recent use, scattered ashes, boot prints in the dust, and, most significantly, several papers left behind in Mateo's haste to leave. Tanner couldn't read well, but he recognized official documents when he saw them. More importantly, he recognized the name Whitcomb. Everyone in the valley remembered Thomas Whitcomb's claims about a never-failing spring, and how he had disappeared with his family during last year's fever outbreak. Gathering the papers, Tanner mounted his horse. This news would be worth something to certain parties in town. By the time he reached the valley settlement, dawn was breaking over the eastern ridge. Back in Mateo's cabin, Ava slept soundly in the bunk wrapped in the bear hide blanket. Mateo sat by the dying fire, watching her peaceful face and thinking about her prayer. He'd forgotten how children could see straight through to the heart of things, naming truths adults tried to hide even from themselves. His sadness, she'd called it, as simply as naming the color of the sky, and just as simply, she'd asked God to help heal it. Mateo wasn't sure he believed in such healing anymore, but watching Ava sleep, he felt something shift inside him like spring ice breaking up after a long winter. A log settled in the fire, sending up sparks. Mateo added another piece of wood, careful not to wake his young guest. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, his shack felt warmer than it had in years, and not just from the fire. Morning brought a biting wind and fresh tasks. Mateo stood in his doorway studying the pale winter sky while Ava finished the last of her breakfast cornbread. "Need to make a supply run," he announced, turning back inside. "Running low on flour, and you could use some medicine for that cough." Ava nodded, brushing crumbs from her worn dress. "Will there be many people in town?" "Some." Mateo began gathering his saddlebags. "Stay close to me. Mind what I say, and we'll be fine." The mule picked its way carefully down the mountain trail, hooves crunching through ice-crusted snow. Mateo had wrapped Ava in his spare coat, but she still shivered against his chest. The sun climbed higher as they descended, offering little warmth through the thin winter clouds. "Town's just around this bend," Mateo said as they approached the valley floor. "Remember what I said?" "Stay close, mind what you say," Ava repeated dutifully. Her small hands tightened on the pommel. The settlement of Pine Creek came into view, a cluster of wooden buildings straddling the stage road, smoke rising from chimneys into the crisp morning air. As they rode past the livery stable, heads began to turn. "That's the Whitcomb girl," a woman whispered loudly to her companion. "Thomas Whitcomb's daughter? The one with the spring claim?" Another voice carried across the street. Mateo felt Ava press closer against him. He fixed his sternest glare on the growing crowd of onlookers, sending most scurrying back to their business. But the whispers continued, following them down the rutted main street. "Her daddy's land had water. Thought the fever took them all. Railroad's been eyeing that spring." Outside Mason's general store, Mateo helped Ava down from the mule. Her legs were stiff from the cold ride, and she stumbled slightly. He steadied her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. The store's bell jingled as they entered. Warm air thick with the smell of coffee, leather, and tobacco enveloped them. Old Tom Mason looked up from his ledger, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Well now," he said, his weathered face creasing into a kind smile. "What have we here?" "Need some supplies, Tom," Mateo said shortly. "Flour, coffee, few other things." Of course. Mason came around the counter, his eyes on Ava. "And who might this young lady be?" Before Mateo could intervene, Ava spoke up. "I'm Ava Whitcomb, sir." "Pleased to meet you." Mason's eyebrows rose, but his smile remained gentle. "Thomas Whitcomb's girl? Why, I remember your father well." "Good man. Your pa." He reached into a glass jar on the counter. "Here now. Every young lady deserves a treat." Ava's eyes widened at the red and white striped peppermint stick he offered. She glanced up at Mateo, who nodded slightly. "Thank you kindly, sir," she said, accepting the candy with careful fingers. Mateo began collecting his supplies while Mason chatted with Ava. The old storekeeper's genuine warmth helped ease some of the tension in Mateo's shoulders, but that relief vanished at the sound of spurs jingling in the doorway. Deputy Marshal Clay Darnell filled the entrance, his badge catching the winter light. His sharp eyes took in the scene, lingering on Ava before settling on Mateo. "Hail," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Didn't expect to see you in town." His voice carried a note of calculated courtesy that set Mateo's teeth on edge. "Just getting supplies," Mateo replied flatly. "And who's your young friend?" Darnell's gaze shifted back to Ava, who had instinctively moved closer to Mateo's side. "No one of consequence to you, Deputy." Darnell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, Mateo, everything in this valley is of consequence to the law, particularly when it involves missing heirs and," he paused significantly, "valuable water rights." Mateo placed himself between Darnell and Ava. "We'll be taking our leave now, Tom," he said, reaching for his coins. "Much obliged for the hospitality." Mason nodded, his own expression gone wary. "Safe travels to you both." As Mateo helped Ava onto the mule, he felt Darnell's stare boring into his back. "Best watch yourself, Hale," the deputy called after them. "Dangerous country for a man alone with secrets to keep." Mateo didn't respond, but his jaw clenched as they rode away from town. The whispers had turned to silence now, the heavy kind that preceded storm clouds. They were halfway back to the mountain trail when movement in the trees caught Mateo's eye. He tensed, but relaxed slightly when he recognized the figure that emerged. Henry, the Apache scout, stepped into their path. His dark eyes were serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Mateo had traded with him before, always finding him fair and direct. "Trouble follows you, friend," Henry said without preamble. Mateo reined the mule to a halt. "Seems that way." Henry's gaze moved to Ava, then back to Mateo. "The railroad boss, Mitchell. He speaks often of a spring in the High Valley. Pure water, never failing, enough to feed his steam engines year-round." He gestured toward town. "Now, words fly like crows about a girl with proof of deed to this water." "What of it?" Mateo's voice was neutral, but his arm tightened protectively around Ava. "Mitchell's men will come," Henry said simply. "They will not ask permission. They will not respect paper rights." His expression softened slightly as he looked at Ava. The child should be prepared. Mateo nodded slowly. He'd seen enough of the railroad's methods to know Henry spoke truth. "Much obliged for the warning." "The old ones say water is life," Henry continued, "but men like Mitchell see only power." He touched his hat brim. "Guard her well, friend. Winter storms gather quickly in these mountains." With that, he melted back into the trees as silently as he'd appeared. Mateo clicked his tongue, urging the mule forward again. His mind was already racing ahead, planning defenses, counting ammunition, considering escape routes. Ava had been quiet through the exchange, but now she spoke softly. "Those men want my pa's spring, don't they?" "Seems so. Pa said the spring was God's gift, meant for everyone to share." Her small fingers gripped Mateo's coat tighter. He wouldn't want them to take it just for their trains. Mateo thought of the deputy's veiled threats of Henry's warnings. The simple truth in Ava's words stood against a tide of greed that had swept away many stronger claims than hers. But looking down at her determined face, he felt his own resolve harden. "No," he said, "we won't let them take it." They rode on through the deepening afternoon, the mule's hooves steady on the familiar trail. Mateo felt Ava's trust in the way she leaned against him, even as his own thoughts turned to the preparations ahead. The mountain winds carried the scent of snow, promising another storm. But it wasn't the weather that worried Mateo now. Henry's words echoed in his mind. Winter storms gather quickly. He'd chosen solitude years ago to escape such troubles. Now, watching Ava's small hand still clutching her peppermint stick, he realized that choice was no longer his to make. The threats would come as certain as winter snow, but this time Mateo wouldn't face the storm alone. Back at the line shack, Mateo watched Ava struggle with an armload of firewood. Her small arms trembled under the weight, but determination shone in her eyes as she carefully placed each log on the growing stack. "That's right," Mateo said, demonstrating the proper technique. "Layer them like building blocks, see? Keeps them steady and dry." Ava nodded, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration as she positioned another piece. "Like this?" "Just so." Mateo allowed himself a slight smile. "You're a quick study." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines as they worked. Mateo had decided that keeping busy was the best way to ward off worry, for both of them. After the wood was stacked, he led Ava to a clearing near the shack. "Time you learned about snares," he said, pulling thin wire from his coat pocket. "Might need fresh meat while I'm checking the far traps." Ava watched intently as Mateo's weathered hands shaped the wire into a loop. He explained each step carefully, how to find a game trail, where to set the trigger, how to secure the anchor. "Remember," he cautioned, "check them early each morning. Don't want any creature suffering longer than necessary." "Yes, sir." Ava's fingers were clumsy at first as she practiced with her own piece of wire, but she didn't give up. By the fourth try, she had fashioned a serviceable snare. "Well done," Mateo said, surprising himself with the pride in his voice. He couldn't remember the last time he'd taught anyone anything. The sky had deepened to purple when they finally headed inside. Mateo stoked the stove while Ava set out their simple supper: beans, cornbread, and the last of the dried venison. The familiar scents filled the small space, making it feel more like a home than it had in years. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the pop of burning pine knots. Mateo noticed Ava stealing glances at him between bites, as if working up courage to speak. Finally, she set down her tin plate. "Mr. Mateo? Did you?" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Did you always live alone up here?" Mateo's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The question stirred memories he'd long tried to bury. Sarah's laugh, little Emma's first steps across this very floor. He set the spoon down slowly. "No," he said at last. "Not always." Ava waited, patient as only children can be when they sense an important truth approaching. Mateo's voice grew rough as he continued. "Had me a wife once, Sarah was her name, and a daughter, Emma. She was about your age. What happened to them?" Ava's question was barely a whisper. Mateo stared into the stove's flame, seeing another fire from long ago. "Cabin caught fire one night while I was checking trap lines. By the time I saw the smoke," he swallowed hard. "Nothing left but ashes." The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief. Then Mateo felt a small hand slip into his own. He looked down to find Ava's fingers wrapped around his calloused palm. "You won't lose me too," she said with quiet certainty. "I promise." Something cracked in Mateo's chest, a wall he'd built around his heart years ago. The simple warmth of her promise both comforted and terrified him. He wanted to believe her, yet feared the pain of losing another child. But before he could respond, Ava yawned widely. The long day had caught up with her at last. "Best get some sleep," Mateo said gruffly, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. "More work tomorrow." As Ava curled up in her borrowed blankets, Mateo added wood to the stove and checked his rifle one last time before settling into his chair by the window. The moon rose over the ridge, casting silver light on the fresh snow. Miles away in a well-appointed office in Pine Creek, Deputy Marshal Darnell stood before a massive oak desk. Railroad boss James Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair, a cigar clamped between his teeth as he listened to the deputy's report. "You're certain it was Thomas Whitcomb's girl?" Mitchell's voice was carefully controlled, but his knuckles had whitened around his cigar. "No doubt," Darnell confirmed. "She's living with Mateo Hale now up in his line shack. Must have the deed papers with her." Mitchell stood and walked to the window, staring out at the railroad yard where his steam engines waited like sleeping giants. "That spring is the key to everything. Year-round water supply. Perfect position for a depot." He turned back to Darnell. "We can't let some mountain hermit and an orphan brat stand in the way of progress." "What are your orders?" Mitchell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Start with persuasion. Remind Hale that accidents happen in the mountains. If he proves stubborn," he shrugged. "Fire has a way of destroying evidence, and that old cabin of Whitcomb's. It's just asking to burn, isn't it?" Darnell nodded, already planning. "I know some men who can handle it quiet-like. We'll move tonight." "Good. See it done." Mitchell returned to his desk, dismissing the deputy with a wave. "And Darnell?" "No witnesses." The deputy touched his hat brim and left. Within an hour, riders began gathering in a sheltered valley below Mateo's shack. They would wait for full dark, then move in. Their horses stamped quietly in the snow as the men checked weapons and passed a bottle for warmth. Up at the line shack, Mateo and Ava rose with the dawn, unaware of the danger approaching. She helped him haul water from the creek while he showed her how to judge ice thickness. The morning passed peacefully as they tended to chores, feeding the mule, checking the new snares, empty but properly set, and patching a draft in the cabin wall. Mateo watched Ava working beside him, her face bright with purpose despite the cold. That small hand in his last night had awakened something he'd thought long dead, a fierce need to protect, to nurture. The very thing that made him most vulnerable could also give him strength to face whatever came. But for now there was only the quiet morning, the clean mountain air, and the simple rhythm of shared work. Mateo allowed himself to savor it, even as his instincts whispered that such peace rarely lasted long in these mountains. Ava's laughter echoed across the snow as she discovered rabbit tracks near the woodpile. "Look, Mr. Mateo, maybe we'll have rabbit stew tomorrow." Mateo smiled despite himself. "Maybe so, little one. Maybe so." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, while in the valley below, patient men waited for darkness to fall. The winter sun hung low on the horizon, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of amber and rose. Mateo had just finished showing Ava how to clean the morning's catch when his body tensed. Years of living alone in the wilderness had sharpened his senses, and now they screamed danger. Horses moving through the timber. "Inside," he whispered to Ava, who looked up from her work with wide eyes. "Quick and quiet." They slipped into the shack, and Mateo immediately moved to extinguish the lamp. Darkness would be their ally tonight. He retrieved his old Winchester rifle from its place above the door, checking the action with practiced hands. Ava pressed close to his side, her small fingers gripping his coat. "Mr. Mateo?" Her voice quavered slightly. "Shh," he soothed, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Stay behind me." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew clearer. Mateo counted at least 6 riders by the different gates, too many for comfort. He positioned himself by the window, rifle ready, while keeping Ava in the shadows behind him. Voices carried through the crisp evening air, getting closer. Boots crunched in snow. A horse nickered. "Hail!" A sharp voice cut through the gathering dusk. "We know you're in there." Mateo recognized Deputy Marshal Darnell's voice, his jaw tightened. "Come on out, Hale," Darnell continued. "We just want to talk about them papers the girls got. Make this easy on yourself." Mateo felt Ava trembling against him. He squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before calling out, "Nothing to talk about, Darnell. This is private property." "Don't be fool-headed about this. That spring claim ain't worth dying over." "Ain't planning on dying," Mateo's voice was steel, "nor on giving up what's rightfully hers." A different voice spoke up, harder and colder than Darnell's. "Last chance, mountain man. Send out them papers or we're coming in to get them." Mateo's response was immediate. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The report cracked across the valley like thunder. Chaos erupted outside. Horses reared and men cursed. Mateo heard boots scrambling in snow and the metallic sound of weapons being drawn. "That's your only warning," Mateo shouted into the darkness. "Next one won't be aimed so high." For several tense moments, only the wind spoke. Then Darnell's voice returned, tight with anger. "This ain't over, Hale. You hear me? We'll be back, and next time we won't be so neighborly about it." Hoofbeats retreated into the timber, but Mateo kept his vigil at the window. He knew better than to trust an easy withdrawal. "Are they gone?" Ava whispered after a long silence. "For now," Mateo answered honestly. "But they'll be back." They kept watch through the long night. Mateo moved between windows, rifle ready, while Ava huddled near the stove wrapped in blankets. Neither slept. The hours stretched eternal, marked only by the haunting chorus of wolves in the distance and the occasional sound of horses moving through the valley below. Ava's quiet voice broke one of the long silences. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mateo. I didn't mean to bring you trouble." Mateo turned from the window to look at her. Moonlight caught the tears on her cheeks. His heart twisted. "Now you listen here," he said, crouching down to meet her eyes. "This ain't your fault. Those men down there, they're the ones bringing trouble, and I won't let them take what's yours. You understand?" She nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve, and promise. The word came easier than he expected. He meant it with every fiber of his being. Dawn was just beginning to pale the eastern sky when they heard a soft whistle from the trees. 3 notes, rising and falling like a thrush's song. Mateo's tension eased slightly. He knew that signal. "Henry," he said quietly and moved to the door. The Apache scout materialized from the shadows like a ghost, his moccasins leaving barely a trace in the snow. His dark eyes took in Mateo's rifle and Ava's worried face. "They will come again tonight," Henry said without preamble. "More men, more guns." He gestured toward the valley. I watched them gather in town. The railroad boss, he offers good money to burn you out. Mateo's grip tightened on his rifle. Let them try. Henry shook his head. Too many. You should take the girl. Go north while you can. The mountains are deep. No. Mateo's response was immediate. Running won't solve this. They'll just keep coming, keep taking what isn't theirs to take. He looked at Ava, remembering her father's cabin and the spring that had sustained generations. This is her land, her birthright. We stand here. Henry studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then you need better shelter than this. He gestured at the line shack's thin walls. The old cabin, it has stone foundation, thick walls. Could be made strong again? Mateo considered this. The abandoned cabin was closer to the spring, with better sight lines and natural protection from the ridge behind it. If they could repair it enough. My papa's cabin? Ava's voice was suddenly bright with hope. Could we really? Mateo looked down at her eager face, then back at Henry. It would take work. A lot of work, and not much time. Then we should begin, Henry said simply. I will help. The sun was just cresting the ridge when they set out. Mateo loaded his mule with tools, food, and blankets, while Henry ranged ahead to check their path. Ava walked between them, clutching her father's Bible and papers close. As they approached the old cabin, dawn's light revealed both its wounds and its potential. The collapsed section of roof could be rebuilt. The stone walls still stood strong. The hearth that had warmed Ava's family could do so again. Mateo watched Ava touch the cabin's weathered logs, her small hand gentle against the wood that had sheltered her earliest memories. Despite the danger waiting in the valley below, her face shone with something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Well, Mateo said, setting down his tools. Best get started. He looked at Henry, who nodded in agreement. Together, they began the work of turning the broken cabin into a fortress. Ava moved among them, carrying smaller pieces of wood and fetching tools, her presence reminding them exactly what they were fighting for. More than just a piece of land or a water claim. They were defending a child's future, her rightful inheritance, and perhaps something even more precious. The chance to make things right in a world that too often forgot its promises. The morning sun climbed higher as they worked, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley where, miles below, their enemies were surely planning the night to come. The winter sun hung high overhead as Mateo led his loaded mule along the snowy path toward the abandoned cabin. Ava walked beside him, her small boots leaving delicate prints in the fresh powder. Henry moved ahead of them, like a shadow, checking their trail and scanning the ridge for any signs of trouble. The old cabin emerged from the trees, its broken shape stark against the white landscape. Snow had drifted through the partially collapsed roof, forming small banks inside. Icy fingers of wind whistled through gaps in the walls, but the foundation stones still stood firm, anchored deep in the mountain soil. Mateo tied the mule in a sheltered spot and began unloading their supplies. First things need to clear that snow, he said, handing Ava a small wooden shovel. Think you can manage that? She nodded eagerly, already moving toward the cabin's entrance. Papa taught me how to shovel last winter, she said proudly, before he got sick. Henry returned from his scout of the perimeter carrying his well-worn axe. No fresh tracks, he reported, but we should work quick. Days are short now. They fell into a natural rhythm of labor. While Ava cleared snow from the cabin's interior, Mateo and Henry assessed the damage. The roof needed the most attention. Several support beams had rotted through, causing the collapse. But the main wall timbers were still solid, protected by the deep eaves from years of weather. Good bones, Henry commented, running a hand along one massive log. Like an old horse. Looks rough, but still strong inside. Mateo grunted agreement as he pulled his crosscut saw from the mule's pack. Reckon we can shore up them walls first, then tackle the roof? He glanced at the sky. Got maybe 6 hours of daylight left. They started with the walls, wedging fresh-cut poles between standing timbers to brace them. Henry's axe rang against wood as he shaped support pieces, while Mateo's saw rasped steadily through fallen logs. The familiar sounds of honest work filled the clearing. Ava finished her shoveling and immediately looked for more ways to help. She gathered smaller stones from the creek bed, carrying them two at a time to where Mateo was rebuilding the chimney. Her face grew red with effort, but she never complained. "Much obliged, little lady," Mateo said as she delivered another pair of rocks. "You're working harder than both of us men put together." She beamed at the praise, then started humming as she went back for more stones. The tune was an old hymn Mateo recognized from his own childhood, "Amazing Grace." Something about her simple faith, expressed in song while she labored, touched a place in his heart he'd thought long frozen. By mid-afternoon, they had the walls secured and half the roof rebuilt. Henry proved skilled at notching logs to fit tight, while Mateo's experience with his own cabin helped them work efficiently. Even the mule contributed, dragging larger timbers into position when needed. Ava kept their spirits up through the long hours. She told stories about helping her father repair fences, asked endless questions about Henry's tracking skills, and shared her own dreams for the cabin's future. "We could plant flowers come spring," she said hopefully, "and maybe keep chickens like Mama used to." Mateo found himself smiling more than he had in years. The girl's optimism was infectious, warming him better than any fire could. He watched her carefully stack kindling near the hearth, her movements precise and purposeful. She had her father's determination, he reckoned. As evening approached, Henry disappeared briefly into the woods. He returned carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that proved to be fresh venison, already cut for stewing. "Took this buck 2 days ago," he explained. "Thought we might need good meat for our work." Mateo got a fire going in the newly rebuilt hearth while Ava helped Henry prepare the stew. They added dried beans and the last of Mateo's potatoes, letting it simmer while they finished the day's work. The smell of cooking food filled the cabin, making it feel more like a home with each passing hour. Night settled over the mountains as they finally sat down to eat. The stew was rich and hearty, warming them from the inside out. Henry had brought fresh bread as well, and they used it to sop up every drop from their tin plates. In the firelight, Henry's dark eyes grew distant as he spoke of Ava's father. "He was a good man," he said softly. "I remember when he first found the spring. He came to our camp, spoke with the elders, said the water should be for everyone, white and Apache both." Ava sat straighter, her face glowing with pride. "Papa always said the spring was a gift from God," she declared, "and gifts are meant for sharing." Mateo watched her face as she spoke of her father's dream. There was something pure in her conviction, something that made his own cynicism seem shabby by comparison. Without thinking, he reached for her father's Bible where it lay beside her. "Would you like me to read some?" he asked, surprising himself as much as her. Ava nodded eagerly, scooting closer to the fire's warmth. Even Henry leaned forward slightly, his usual stoic expression softening. Mateo opened the worn book carefully, its pages familiar now from their evening readings in his shack. He found the book of Psalms and began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The ancient words filled the cabin, mixing with the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of wind outside. Ava closed her eyes, mouthing the verses she knew by heart. Henry sat perfectly still, his face thoughtful as he listened. What none of them saw was the dark figure crouching in the shadows beyond the cabin's new walls, one of Deputy Darnell's hired men, sent to watch their movements. He noted the strengthened walls, the rebuilt roof, the easy way the three worked together. Most importantly, he saw how the cabin was becoming more than just shelter. It was becoming a symbol of resistance to the railroad's plans. The spy waited until Mateo finished reading, until the fire had died down and they'd prepared for sleep. Then he slipped away through the darkness, heading down the mountain to report what he'd seen. By sunrise, Darnell would know that taking the cabin would not be as simple as he'd hoped. Inside, unaware of their observer, Mateo helped Ava make a bed near the hearth using blankets from his shack. Henry chose to sleep near the door, his rifle close at hand. As Mateo settled into his own blankets, he heard Ava's quiet voice. "Mr. Mateo?" "Yes?" "Thank you for helping make Papa's cabin strong again." He swallowed past a sudden tightness in his throat. "You're welcome, little one. Now get some sleep. More work tomorrow." The fire's glow painted soft shadows on the cabin's walls that now stood straight and true, rebuilt by their shared labor. Mateo listened to Ava's breathing grow steady with sleep, while Henry kept silent watch by the door. Outside, snow began falling again, but inside the cabin was warm with more than just firelight. Mateo realized as sleep took him that he'd found something he'd thought forever lost: a family. Different from his first, formed not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. Yet no less real for that. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight in this restored cabin they were home. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain valley. Mateo saddled his mule early, checking the cinch twice before mounting. He'd spent half the night worrying about leaving Ava, even with Henry's protection, but they needed supplies to fortify the cabin properly. "I'll be back before sundown," Mateo promised, looking down at Ava from the saddle. She stood beside Henry in the cabin doorway, wrapped in one of Mateo's old blankets against the morning chill. "We will be fine," Henry assured him, one hand resting protectively on Ava's shoulder. "The child and I have much to learn from each other today." Ava nodded eagerly. "Henry's going to show me how to catch rabbits." Her excitement made Mateo smile despite his concerns. "Mind what Henry tells you," Mateo said, "and stay close to the cabin." He turned the mule down the trail, glancing back once to see Ava waving. The sight of her there, safe with Henry, eased some of his worry. Still, he kept one hand near his rifle as he rode, alert for any movement in the timber. The town lay quiet when Mateo arrived, though eyes watched from behind curtained windows. He tied his mule outside the general store, noting how conversation died when he entered. Mrs. Peterson, the owner's wife, gave him a sympathetic look as she gathered his order of flour and coffee. "Folks been talking," she said softly, glancing around to ensure no one was near. "Some say it ain't right, what the railroad's trying to do to that child's claim." Mateo nodded, keeping his voice equally low. "Appreciate knowing that, ma'am. My Thomas says he remembers when her father filed those water rights proper and legal." She wrapped the flour carefully in brown paper. "Railroad can't just take what ain't theirs, no matter how much money they wave around." From the street came the sound of boots on wooden planks. Deputy Darnell passed by the store window, his shadow falling across the counter between them. Mrs. Peterson quickly busied herself with measuring coffee beans. Mateo felt the tension rise as several men gathered outside, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "Ought to run that mountain man out," one said. "Him and that Apache both." "Hanging's too good for claim jumpers," another added, loud enough to ensure Mateo heard. Mateo finished his purchase without responding to the threats, though his jaw tightened. He needed more supplies, but he'd wait until the crowd dispersed before visiting other shops. At the blacksmith's, old Jake Wilson was more direct. "Deputies gathering men," he warned while wrapping Mateo's purchase of nails. "Talking about riding up there in force, maybe 3 days from now?" He hesitated, then added, "Some of us, we remember how things used to be before the railroad started squeezing folks dry. That spring water ought to be for everybody, like the girl's father wanted." "Much obliged for the warning," Mateo said quietly. He added ammunition to his purchases, noting how Jake slipped extra boxes under the counter wrap without charging for them. The hardware store proved more hostile. The owner, in debt to the railroad, refused to sell to him entirely. But at the feed store, the widow Carson not only filled his order, but added extra grain for that poor child. All morning, Mateo felt Deputy Darnell's eyes following him. The man lounged outside the saloon, making no move to interfere, but radiating menace. Their gazes met once across the dusty street. The deputy's hand drifted to his gun belt, a silent promise of violence to come. Back at the cabin, Ava was having a far different experience. Henry proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to set snares using supple willow branches and twine. His strong hands guided hers as she learned to tie the proper knots. "Like this?" she asked, holding up her finished snare. Henry examined it carefully. "Good. You learn quick like your father did." "You knew my papa well?" "He respected the old ways," Henry said, setting the snare carefully beside a rabbit trail. "Understood that land and water belonged to no one man alone." They spent the morning checking Henry's trapline. Ava asking endless questions about tracking and woodcraft. He showed her how to read animal signs in the snow, how to move quietly through brush, how to spot the best places for snares. After catching 2 rabbits, they returned to the cabin. Henry taught her to clean the game, his movements precise and respectful. "We thank the animal for its gift," he explained. "Waste nothing." While the rabbit stewed, Henry showed her how to fletch arrows, explaining how different feathers affected flight. Ava proved to have a steady hand with the delicate work. "Uncle Henry," she said suddenly, testing the name, "would you teach me to shoot a bow someday?" Henry's normally stoic expression softened at the title. "When you are ready, little one. When you are ready." The sun was setting when they heard Mateo's mule on the trail. Ava ran to meet him, helping to unload supplies while chattering about her day with Henry. Mateo noticed how she moved with more confidence in the woods now, and how Henry watched her with quiet pride. Inside the warm cabin, they shared rabbit stew while Mateo reported on the town's mood. He kept the worst of the threats to himself, but made clear that trouble was coming. "We'll need to be extra careful now," he said. "No fires at night, no moving far from the cabin." Ava listened solemnly, then asked, "Can we pray for them? The townspeople?" Mateo and Henry exchanged glances, surprised by her request. "Even the deputy?" Mateo asked. "Especially him," Ava said firmly. "Papa always said, prayer changes hearts." Before Mateo could respond, she folded her hands and began, "Dear Lord, please help the people in town remember that your gifts are for everyone. Help them be brave enough to stand up for what's right. And please keep us safe, especially Mr. Mateo and Uncle Henry. Amen." Mateo felt something shift inside him at her simple words. Here was this child, who had lost everything, praying not for herself but for others, even those who meant her harm. His own reluctance to believe, his years of bitter doubt, seemed shabby compared to her pure faith. Henry's voice broke the silence. "Your father would be proud, little one." Mateo could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He busied himself checking the cabin's defenses while Ava helped Henry clean up from supper. Her quiet humming of hymns filled the cabin, a counterpoint to the wind's moan outside. Later, as Ava slept near the banked fire, Mateo kept watch by the window. Henry's voice came soft beside him. "The child changes things," the Apache said. "Makes men remember who they could be." Mateo thought of the divided town, of those who'd helped him today despite their fear. Maybe she shames us into being better than we are. "Or reminds us of what we once were," Henry replied, "before fear and greed hardened our hearts." Mateo watched Ava's peaceful sleep, remembering her prayer. Perhaps faith wasn't about certainty, he reflected, but about choosing to believe in something bigger than oneself, something worth fighting for. Outside, snow began falling again, coating the valley in fresh white. Mateo knew trouble was coming, but for now, in this moment, they were safe. The cabin stood strong around them, and Ava's quiet breathing spoke of trust and hope. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. The Sunday morning sun painted the snow-covered valley in brilliant diamonds, but its beauty brought no warmth. Mateo's breath frosted in the bitter air as he saddled his mule. Beside him, Henry prepared his own mount while Ava bounced eagerly near the cabin door, already dressed in her best, a freshly cleaned dress Mrs. Peterson had given her. "Papa always said the Sabbath was the Lord's day," Ava declared, pulling on her worn wool coat. "No matter what." Mateo adjusted the mule's bridle, fighting down his unease. "Might be safer to hold our own service here." "The Lord will protect us," Ava said with complete conviction. Her faith made Mateo's doubts feel somehow smaller. Henry spoke quietly as he helped Ava mount behind Mateo. Sometimes courage is found in simple things. Breaking bread together. Sharing God's word. The ride into town took longer than usual. They kept to the main trail, not wanting to appear furtive. The church bell was already ringing as they approached, its clear tones carrying across the frozen landscape. Mateo noticed how Ava sat straighter at the sound, her small hands tightening on his coat. The little white church stood at the edge of town, its steeple reaching toward the crystal blue sky. Several townsfolk were already filing in as Mateo helped Ava down from the mule. He caught worried glances, heard whispered conversations stop as they approached. Henry dismounted silently, his presence drawing even more stares. At the church steps, Mateo hesitated. It had been years since he'd entered a house of worship. But Ava took his hand firmly, tugging him forward with the same determination she'd shown that first day in the snow. The interior was warm, lit by morning sun through frosted windows. Wooden pews creaked as heads turned to watch them enter. Mateo saw Deputy Darnell in the back row, his face darkening. But others nodded cautiously. The Petersons, Widow, Carson, Old, Jake Wilson, from the smithy. They took seats near the middle, Ava between Mateo and Henry. The girl seemed oblivious to the tension, her eyes fixed on the cross above the altar. Soon, Preacher Matthews stepped up to the pulpit, his weathered face surveying his congregation. His gaze lingered on their unusual trio before he opened his Bible. Today's reading, he announced in his deep voice, it comes from John chapter 4. He paused, then continued. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. Mateo felt Ava straighten beside him. The preacher's eyes met hers as he spoke of the woman at the well, of living water freely given. His sermon wove together physical thirst and spiritual hunger, the need for both earthly and heavenly sustenance. Throughout, his gaze kept returning to Ava, and when he finished, the congregation sat in thoughtful silence. Then Ava stood suddenly, her small figure drawing every eye. "Excuse me, Preacher Matthews?" she said clearly, her voice carrying in the quiet church. "My papa always said the same thing about our spring." Mateo started to reach for her, but Henry's hand on his arm stopped him. "You see," Ava continued, "Papa found that spring up in the ridge and marked it proper. But he didn't mark it just for us. He said clean water was God's gift to everyone, not something to be sold or hoarded." She looked around the church, meeting surprised faces without fear. That's why he filed the claim, so everyone could use it, not just those with money to buy it. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Mateo saw some nodding, others frowning. Deputy Darnell's face had gone red with anger. But Preacher Matthews was smiling. "Out of the mouths of babes," he said softly. Then louder, "The child speaks truth. Water, like God's grace, was meant to be shared." He stepped down from the pulpit, approaching their pew. "Miss Ava, would you and your guardians permit me to hold next Sunday's service at your cabin, to dedicate it anew as a place of worship and fellowship?" The deputy stood abruptly. "Now see here." "It would be our honor," Ava interrupted brightly, drowning out his protest. "Papa would have loved that." More whispers filled the church. Mateo saw fear on some faces, but also something else, a spark of defiance, of hope. The preacher's declaration had drawn a line that forced people to choose sides. "Then it's settled," Preacher Matthews announced. "Next Sunday we worship at the Whitcomb cabin. All are welcome." His emphasis on the last word was unmistakable. The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers. Mateo found himself singing along, remembered words returning after years of silence. Beside him, Ava's clear voice rose sweet and true. Even Henry hummed quietly, honoring their shared faith in his own way. Afterward, as they prepared to leave, several townspeople approached. Mrs. Peterson pressed a basket of fresh bread and preserves into Ava's hands. Jake Wilson promised to bring tools to help further repair the cabin. Widow Carson hugged Ava, whispering encouragement. But others hurried past without meeting their eyes. The deputy and his friends gathered in angry knots, speaking in low voices. Mateo kept Ava close as they made their way to their mounts. "That was quite a speech, little one," Henry said as they rode home. Ava smiled. "I just said what Papa would have." Mateo studied her proud profile. "Your father would be mighty pleased, I reckon." He glanced back at the town, growing distant behind them. "Though you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest." "Truth often does," Henry observed. They rode on in companionable silence, the cold air nipping at their faces. Mateo found his thoughts turning to the coming Sunday, to the preparations needed to host the service. The cabin would need more work, benches to build, space to clear. Yet beneath his practical concerns ran a deeper current of wonder. Back at the cabin, they shared Mrs. Peterson's bread and preserves for lunch. Ava chattered excitedly about plans for the service, where people would sit, what hymns to sing, how to decorate with pine boughs. "We'll need to fix that north wall proper," Mateo mused, eyeing the rough repairs. "And maybe build some kind of shelter for folks' horses." "I will bring more stones for the chimney," Henry added. "Make it strong before next Sunday." Ava beamed at them both. "See? God is helping already, sending us friends." Mateo wanted to caution her that enemies were gathering too, that the deputy and railroad men wouldn't take this challenge lightly. But looking at her shining face, he couldn't bring himself to dim her joy. Instead, he found himself sharing her hope despite his fears. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the snow, they gathered around the fire to plan. Henry sketched ideas in the ash for improving the cabin's defense while making it welcoming. Mateo listed needed supplies and repairs. Ava copied out favorite hymns from her father's Bible in her careful handwriting. "Will you read us something, Mr. Mateo?" she asked, holding out the Bible. "Something about courage?" Mateo took the worn book, finding comfort in its familiar weight. As he began to read about David facing Goliath, he saw the story with new eyes. Sometimes the smallest champions could change everything, armed with nothing but faith and truth. Outside, the winter wind sang through pine boughs. Inside, lamplight gleamed on Ava's bright face as she listened, on Henry's thoughtful profile, on the rough walls that sheltered them. Mateo felt God's presence more strongly than he had in years, as if the cabin itself had become sacred space. None of them could know what plots were being laid in town, what dark plans took shape in secret meetings. For now, they had this moment, warm, safe, united in purpose. The rest would come as it would, guided by a hand greater than their own. The week unfolded like a well-worn hymnal, each day bringing new purpose to the cabin. Dawn found Mateo and Henry already at work, their breath frosting in the crisp morning air as they hauled logs and measured boards. The steady rhythm of axe and saw filled the clearing, punctuated by the tap of hammer on nail. "Reckon this roof'll hold through anything now," Mateo said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the winter chill. They had reinforced the beams with fresh timber, laying new shingles in neat rows. Henry nodded, running his hand along a freshly squared beam, strong enough for many winters to come. His dark eyes swept the clearing. Good medicine here now. Place wants to live again. Below them, Ava darted between wood piles, gathering kindling in her apron. Her clear voice carried up as she sang snatches of hymns, practicing for Sunday. Mateo found himself humming along, surprised to remember the words after so many silent years. They dug the root cellar deep, shoring its walls with stone and timber. Henry showed them how to weave pine boughs for shelter, the way his people had done for generations. Mateo built rough benches from split logs enough to seat 30 people. Inside the cabin, Ava threw herself into learning household tasks. Widow Carson had loaned them a butter churn, and the girl worked it faithfully each morning, her small arms never tiring. "Look, Mr. Mateo," she called one afternoon, proudly holding up her first pat of butter. "Mrs. Peterson showed me how yesterday. Now we can have proper biscuits for the service." Mateo touched her head gently. "Your mama would be proud seeing you keep house so fine." Her smile wavered only slightly at the mention of her mother. "I remember how she did things. Sometimes I pretend she's watching, showing me still." Throughout the week, word spread through town. Riders passed on the trail below, some waving, others averting their eyes. The general store owner sent supplies, coffee, sugar, flour, carried by his son, who whispered that half the town planned to come. "Deputy's mad as a wet hen," the boy reported. "Railroad boss, too. Been having meetings at the saloon, but lots of folks ain't listening anymore." By Saturday evening, the first wagons appeared. The Peterson family arrived with quilts and extra chairs. The blacksmith brought his wife and daughters, carrying baskets of food. Widow Carson came with her grown sons, who immediately began setting up more benches in the yard. As dusk settled, more families gathered. Lanterns bobbed through the trees like earthbound stars as people found their way up the snowy track. Children darted between adults, their excited whispers carrying on the evening air. Women arranged food on plank tables while men gathered in small groups, talking quietly. Mateo watched from the cabin door, amazed at how the clearing had transformed. Henry appeared at his shoulder, silent as always. "Never thought to see such a gathering here," Mateo murmured. "The people choose truth when given chance," Henry replied, "like water finding its path." Ava flitted between the groups, glowing with welcome. She knew everyone's names, asked after their families, showed children where to play safely. Mateo marveled at her natural grace, so like her father's way with people. They spent the night in the cabin while most families returned to town, promising to come back at dawn. Mateo barely slept, watching moonlight pattern the new-laid floor. In the other bunk, Ava's breathing came soft and steady, peaceful in her faith. Sunday morning broke clear and cold, the sun casting long shadows across fresh snow. People began arriving early, dressed in their Sunday best. By 9 o'clock, nearly 40 souls had gathered in the clearing. Preacher Matthews arrived last, his buggy creaking up the trail. He carried his Bible and wore his formal black coat, his manner grave but determined. Mateo met him at the cabin steps. "Quite a congregation you've drawn," the preacher said, surveying the crowd. "It's the girl's doing," Mateo replied. "She has a way of making folks believe." The preacher smiled. "The Lord works through the smallest vessels sometimes." He squared his shoulders. "Shall we begin?" They arranged everyone in a rough semicircle, facing the cabin's open door. Some sat on benches, others stood, a few perched on wagon seats. The morning air rang with greetings and murmured prayers. Preacher Matthews raised his hands for silence. Opening his Bible, he began to read. "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." His voice carried clear in the winter stillness. Mateo stood behind Ava, one hand on her shoulder, as the familiar words washed over them. Henry remained slightly apart, respecting the ceremony while holding to his own ways. The preacher spoke of community, of sharing God's gifts, of standing together against greed and fear. He blessed the cabin, the spring, the land itself. When he prayed over Ava, calling her forward, many eyes grew wet with tears. "This child," he declared, "has reminded us of truths we had forgotten. That water, like grace, flows for all. That faith, like love, grows stronger when shared." They sang then, voices rising pure and strong into the morning air. "Amazing Grace" swelled from the gathering, followed by "Rock of Ages" and "Shall We Gather at the River." Mateo found himself singing full-throated, surprising himself with the joy of it. For that shining hour, hope bloomed like winter roses. Mateo saw it in the clasped hands of neighbors, in children playing freely, in the way people lingered to talk who had been strangers before. This, he realized, was what Ava's father had dreamed of. Not just water rights, but right relations between neighbors. Yet even in this moment of grace, darkness lurked. Mateo noticed the railroad man too late, a narrow-faced stranger slouching at the edge of the crowd, watching with cold eyes. When their gazes met, the man turned and slipped away into the trees. Mateo started to follow, but stopped himself. This was a time for fellowship, not fear. The day stretched long and sweet. Women spread dinner on the plank tables, fried chicken, cornbread, preserved peaches. Men discussed spring planting and shared tools. Children played tag between the trees until their mothers called them home. As afternoon drew down, wagons began leaving one by one. People hugged Ava, thanked Mateo and Henry, promised to return next Sunday. Soon the clearing stood empty again, though somehow fuller than before. That evening they sat quiet around the fire, tired but content. Ava dozed in her chair, clutching her father's Bible. Henry carved a small wooden horse, his hands moving sure and steady. Mateo stared into the flames, feeling the weight of the day settle in his heart. Without planning to, he found himself speaking. "Lord," he said roughly, the word strange on his tongue after so many silent years. "Thank you for this day, for this child, for hope reborn." He paused, struggling. "Help us be worthy of such grace. Amen," Ava murmured sleepily. Henry's knife stilled. "Amen," he echoed softly. Outside, wind sighed through the pines. Inside, firelight danced on the walls of their sanctuary, warm with the day's blessings. Mateo felt peace settle over him like a familiar blanket, grateful for this moment of pure belonging. The wind picked up as night descended, whistling through the pine boughs and rattling the cabin's new shutters. Inside, Mateo stoked the fire one last time before bed, while Ava sat cross-legged on her bunk, reading her father's Bible by lamplight. Henry had left earlier to check his trapline, promising to return by morning. "Time for sleep, little one," Mateo said, watching how the firelight caught in her hair, so like his lost daughter's. Ava nodded, carefully marking her place with a piece of yarn. "Mr. Mateo, do you think Mama and Papa can see us from heaven? See how we fixed their cabin?" The question caught in Mateo's throat. Before he could answer, a sharp crack split the night. Not thunder, but something else. Mateo's spine stiffened. Years of mountain living had taught him to read sounds like writing. That wasn't natural. A flicker of orange light suddenly danced across the wall, coming from outside. Mateo's heart stopped. He knew that light, knew its hungry glow. Fire. "Ava, get down!" he shouted, just as flames licked up the outer wall beside the window. The dry wood, despite its newness, caught quickly. Mateo grabbed his rifle and water bucket. "Stay inside," he ordered Ava, who stood frozen, clutching her Bible. He burst through the door into swirling snow, throwing water at the flames. The wind whipped embers into his face. Gunshots cracked through the darkness. Henry's voice rang out from the trees, returning fire at shadowy figures that ducked between trunks. The Apache's presence was unexpected salvation. He must have sensed trouble and doubled back. Inside, Ava screamed. Smoke had begun pouring through the roof seams where pitch-soaked torches had been thrown. Mateo's heart thundered as he packed snow against the burning wall, but for every flame he doused, 2 more sprang up. "Mateo!" Henry's shout carried over the chaos. "More coming from the south." The roof was fully ablaze now, decades-old timber crackling like kindling. Smoke poured from every seam. Mateo's lungs burned as he raced back inside, where Ava huddled in a corner, coughing. "We have to go." He scooped her up, her small body trembling against his chest. The Bible tumbled from her grip as he carried her out into the snow. Behind them, support beams groaned. "The papers," Ava cried, struggling to go back. "Papa's papers." Mateo held her tight, his heart breaking. "No time, child. Your life's worth more than any paper." They stumbled to the tree line where Henry provided covering fire, driving back the attackers. The 3 could only watch as flames devoured the cabin. The roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a geyser of sparks into the night sky. Ava sobbed against Mateo's chest as her home burned for the second time. The deed, the map, her father's careful markings of the spring, all of it consumed by fire. Mateo felt hollow, cursed. Once again, he had failed to protect a home, to shield a child from loss. Henry appeared beside them, his rifle still warm. "Railroad men," he said grimly. "Saw their horses. Same ones who were watching at the service." Mateo's jaw clenched. Of course, they had waited until the townspeople left until the cabin was vulnerable. A swift, merciless strike to erase Ava's claim forever. The fire burned hot and fast, fed by seasoned wood and winter wind. By midnight, only the stone chimney stood, a dark finger pointing accusingly at the sky. Smoke and ash filled the air, stinging their eyes, coating the pristine snow with gray. They huddled together as the temperature dropped, sharing Henry's blanket. Mateo held Ava close, trying to warm her shivering form. Her tears had dried, leaving tracks in the soot on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I'm so sorry, little one." "Not your fault," she mumbled, her voice hoarse from smoke. "You tried to save it." Her simple absolution cut deeper than blame would have. Mateo looked at the ruins of the cabin, their refuge, their hope, their chance at family, now nothing but smoldering timber. The sight brought back that other terrible night, when flames had taken his wife and daughter. Different cabin, same crushing grief. Henry stood watch through the long hours, his figure a dark silhouette against the fading embers. Occasionally, he would disappear into the trees, checking for any returning attackers. But the railroad men had accomplished their goal. They had no reason to return. The wind died as false dawn crept over the mountains. The temperature plummeted further, freezing their clothes stiff with sweat and snow. They had nothing. No food, no shelter, no proof of Ava's inheritance. Even the Bible. Her last link to her parents lay somewhere in the ashes. Mateo felt the weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. He had dared to hope again, to believe in something bigger than survival. Now that hope lay in ruins, just like the cabin. He was cursed to watch homes burn, to lose family over and over. Ava stirred in his arms as true dawn finally broke. Her face was pale with cold and exhaustion, but her eyes held something Mateo couldn't name. Not quite defeat, not quite defiance. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. Mateo had no answer. They sat in silence as the sun rose over the smoking ruins, three broken souls unsure where to turn, their breath frosting in the bitter morning air. Henry finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of generations who had faced similar losses. "The land remains," he said. "The spring still flows. Papers burn, but truth does not." Mateo looked at him sharply, but the Apache's face revealed nothing more. They huddled closer as the day brightened, surrounded by destruction, yet somehow still breathing, still together. The cabin was gone, but something else had been forged in its flames, something that even fire couldn't touch. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. Where the cabin had stood, thin wisps of smoke still rose from the ruins, carrying with them the ashes of dreams and documents. But as Mateo held Ava close, feeling her heart beat against his chest, he knew that paper wasn't the only way to prove a claim. Sometimes truth lived in the heart, passed down through love and memory, stronger than any written word. They sat together beside the smoldering ruins, cold and broken, yet not entirely without hope. The spring still flowed somewhere up the mountain, waiting to be found again. The truth of Ava's inheritance still lived in their memories, and in the hearts of those townspeople who had gathered just yesterday to worship and witness. But for now they could only wait as morning painted the sky in watercolor hues, their future as uncertain as smoke in the wind. The trek back to Mateo's line shack stretched long and bitter through the morning hours. Each step felt heavier than the last as they pushed through knee-deep snow. The wind had picked up again, driving icy needles into their faces and numbing their hands despite their best efforts to keep warm. Ava stumbled between Mateo and Henry, her small frame racked with shivers. Her dress, still damp from the night's firefighting, had frozen stiff in places. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to their sleepless vigil by the burning cabin. "Here now," Mateo said gruffly, stopping in his tracks. "Come up, little one." He bent down and scooped Ava into his arms. She weighed no more than a sack of flour, her body trembling against his chest. The gesture brought back sharp memories of carrying his own daughter through mountain storms, memories that cut like knives. Henry took point, breaking trail through the deepest drifts. The Apache moved with quiet efficiency, checking their back trail occasionally to ensure no one followed. Though the railroad men had accomplished their destruction, there was no telling if they might still lurk in the timber. Mateo's arms ached as they climbed the last ridge toward his shack. Ava had dozed off despite the cold, her breath shallow against his neck. Guilt gnawed at his insides. He should have posted better watch, should have known the railroad wouldn't let them be after the church service. Should have. The words beat in time with his steps. The sight of his line shack hunched against the wind like a worn-out dog had never been so welcome. Henry hurried ahead to break trail to the door and get a fire started. Mateo followed in his tracks, careful not to jostle Ava awake. Inside, the shack was cold as a tomb. While Henry worked the stove, Mateo settled Ava on his narrow bunk, wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Her face was pale as milk, except for 2 bright spots of fever on her cheeks. The night's terror had taken its toll. "She needs warming quick," Henry said, feeding kindling into the stove. "Still got that coffee?" Mateo nodded, finding the tin of grounds tucked away on a shelf. His hands shook as he measured them out. The familiar routine helped steady him, but couldn't quiet the storm in his mind. What were they to do now? The cabin was gone, along with all proof of Ava's claim. They couldn't hide in his shack forever. The railroad men would find them eventually. The stove began to warm the small space as coffee bubbled in the pot. Henry had settled on a stool by the door, his rifle across his knees. Mateo paced the worn floorboards, his thoughts darker with each turn. Maybe, he started, then stopped, the words bitter in his mouth. Maybe the county orphanage would be safer for her. Just until… No. Ava's voice, though weak, carried steel. She pushed herself up on the bunk, blankets falling around her shoulders. Please don't send me away. Mateo couldn't meet her eyes. Child, these men mean business. They've already burned one home. I can't protect you proper, not from all of them. You can't give up. Ava's lower lip trembled, but her gaze held firm. Papa always said the spring of the righteous will not run dry. He said it over and over, especially when Mama got sick. He believed it right to the end. Shame flooded Mateo's chest. Here he was, a grown man ready to surrender, while this slip of a girl showed more faith than he'd managed in years. He turned away, busying himself with the coffee pot, unable to face her trust in him. Your father was wise to believe so strongly, Henry said quietly. He set his rifle aside and reached into his jacket, pulling out a leather pouch that had seen better days. Wise enough to know men's hearts and to plan for darkness. Mateo looked up sharply at the Apache's tone. Henry carefully opened the pouch, withdrawing several folded papers, yellowed but intact. What's that? Mateo asked, though something in his chest already knew. Copies, Henry said simply, of the water filings, the spring survey, the deed. Your father, he nodded to Ava, brought them to me 3 summers ago. Said he feared foul play, wanted them kept safe on reservation land where white men's greed rarely reaches. Mateo stared at the papers, hardly daring to breathe. Hope, that dangerous ember he'd thought extinguished, flickered to life in his chest. Ava's eyes had gone wide. Papa trusted you with these? Henry nodded solemnly. He was a good man, your father. Treated my people fair, shared water rights when others would fence them off. Said the spring was God's gift, meant for all his children. He held the papers out to Mateo with careful reverence. These are the originals he filed with the Territory Office. These copies bear the same stamps, same signatures. Legal and binding. Mateo's hands shook as he took the papers. The territorial seal was there, clear as day, along with the surveyor's mark and witness signatures. Everything they needed to prove Ava's claim, preserved by one man's foresight and another's loyalty. Why didn't you tell us before? Mateo asked, his voice rough. Needed to be sure first, Henry replied. Sure of your heart, sure you would stand with her when trouble came. Now I know. He smiled faintly. You proved it in fire. Ava slipped from the bunk, blankets trailing behind her like a queen's robes. She crossed to Henry and threw her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for keeping Papa's trust. The Apache's usually stoic expression softened as he patted her back. Your father was my friend, he said simply. His dream of sharing waters must not die. Mateo sank onto a stool, the papers trembling in his grasp. Just hours ago, they'd watched all hope burn with the cabin. Now Providence had handed them a second chance, delivered through the faithful hands of an Apache scout who'd kept his word when all others had failed. God has not abandoned us, Ava said, her voice still muffled against Henry's shoulder. Just like Papa said, the spring still flows. Mateo looked at the child, this remarkable, resilient child who had lost everything yet never lost faith. Shame and gratitude warred in his chest. He'd been ready to give up, to send her away, while God had already prepared their deliverance through Henry's loyalty. The line shack slowly warmed as morning crept toward noon. Coffee steamed in their cups, and color returned to Ava's cheeks as she huddled near the stove. The papers lay safe on the table, proof that justice might yet prevail. Mateo watched Ava and Henry share a quiet conversation, the Apache teaching her a few words in his native tongue while she giggled at the strange sounds. Something had shifted in the small shack, something beyond the mere preservation of documents. Hope had returned, yes, but more than that. Trust had been proven, faith rewarded, friendship deepened in the crucible of loss. The cabin was gone, but perhaps they had gained something more valuable, the certainty that they did not stand alone. Mateo wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, letting its warmth seep into his bones. The road ahead would not be easy. The railroad men would not give up their plans without a fight. But now, they had a chance. More than a chance. They had truth preserved, friendship proven, and a child's unwavering faith to light their way. The morning wore on as they rested and recovered, safe for the moment in the shelter of Mateo's humble shack. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of their retreat, while inside, 3 unlikely allies shared warmth, coffee, and the quiet certainty that Providence had not finished with them yet. Dawn painted the frozen valley in shades of rose and amber as Mateo saddled his mule. The morning air bit sharp, his breath rising in clouds. Henry waited astride his pony, patient as always. Mrs. Patterson, a widow from the next homestead over, had arrived to watch Ava, bringing fresh biscuits and a kind smile. "You be careful now," Ava said, hugging Mateo's waist before he mounted. Her small face was pinched with worry. "Don't you fret none," Mateo assured her, patting her shoulder. "We'll be back before dark." They set out at a steady pace, hooves crunching through crusted snow. The trail wound through stands of pine and over rocky ridges. Frozen creeks glinted like broken glass in the morning light. Mateo hunched deeper into his coat, grateful for the wool scarf Ava had insisted he wear. "Your girl has a good heart," Henry observed after they'd ridden in silence for an hour. Mateo nodded, surprised at how natural it felt now to hear Ava called his. "That she does. Stronger than mine, truth be told." They crossed 3 ice-choked streams before reaching the reservation boundary. The agency building squatted on a low hill, a weather-beaten structure of rough-hewn logs and tin roof. Smoke curled from its stone chimney. Inside, the clerk looked up from his ledger. Recognition flickered across his weathered features when Henry explained their business. "Whitcomb's papers? Yes, I remember that day clear as spring water. Honorable man, that one? Always dealt square with us." The clerk disappeared into a back room, returning with a leather packet wrapped in oilcloth. Kept these safe, just as he asked. Knew someday they'd matter. He handed them to Henry with careful respect. Good to know his child survived. The spring should flow as he wished it. Mateo marveled at how far Ava's father's foresight had reached, how many hands had helped preserve his dream. The man had known the risks, had planted seeds of protection in fertile soil. The return journey proved more treacherous than their morning ride. Near Wolf Creek Pass, Henry raised his hand in warning. Mateo reined in, hearing horses ahead. Around the bend, 4 railroad men blocked the narrow trail, rifles ready across their saddles. Mateo's hand crept toward his own weapon, but Henry made a slight gesture. "Wait." The Apache's calm presence steadied Mateo's racing heart. "Long ride from town," Henry observed mildly, as if commenting on the weather. The railroad men shifted uneasily. Their leader, a hard-faced man Mateo recognized from town, spat into the snow. "Accidents bound to happen. Way you boys ride these dangerous trails." "Many eyes watch these paths," Henry replied. His voice remained gentle, but something in his tone made the horses stamp nervously. Apache eyes. Town eyes. God's eyes, too, some might say. A tense silence stretched. Mateo felt sweat freeze beneath his collar despite the cold. One wrong move and bullets would fly. Finally, the leader jerked his head. "Let's ride, boys." Another time. They wheeled their horses, vanishing into the timber. Mateo released a shaky breath. "That was too close." "Not close enough for them," Henry said. "They fear witnesses more than God." They pushed hard through the afternoon, taking back trails when possible. The sun was settling toward the peaks when they finally spotted smoke from Mateo's chimney. Ava burst from the door at the sound of hooves running through the snow. "You're back." She collided with Mateo as he dismounted, nearly knocking him over. "Mrs. Patterson let me help make soup, and I've been praying all day and—" She stopped, eyes widening at the packet Henry carefully withdrew from his coat. "Are those?" "Your father's papers," Mateo confirmed, "safe and sound." Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thank the Lord you made it back. Come in where it's warm. Soup's hot and ready." Inside, they gathered around Mateo's small table while Henry unwrapped the packet. The papers were yellowed but pristine, protected by oilcloth and faith. Mateo ran his fingers over the territorial seal, the signatures, the careful surveys marking the spring's location. "We'll ride to the county seat tomorrow," he declared. "Get these before the judge proper and legal. Time to make your father's dream real, little one." Ava beamed, hope shining in her eyes bright as the evening star. Mateo felt answering determination rise in his chest. They had the truth in their hands now. Come morning, they would see justice done. Dawn mist clung to the valley as Mateo hitched the wagon. Frost sparkled on leather reins and wooden seatboards. He'd borrowed the rig from Mrs. Patterson, knowing the journey to the county seat would prove too hard for Ava on horseback. The girl sat wrapped in quilts beside him, fidgeting with excitement and nerves. Henry rode ahead on his pony, alert for trouble, while the preacher brought up the rear in his buggy. The precious papers lay secured in oilskin beneath the wagon seat, protected from the damp morning air. "Will the judge be very fierce?" Ava asked, her small voice wavering. She twisted the edge of her shawl between thin fingers. "Reckon he'll be fair," Mateo answered, though his own stomach churned. "That's all we need. Fairness and truth." The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ruts as they followed the winding road down from the high country. Ava chattered steadily, asking about the courthouse, the town, whether the judge would let her speak. Mateo answered what he could, his responses growing shorter as his own anxiety mounted. By late afternoon, when the sun hung low and golden in the western sky, they reached the Wayside Inn. It was a weathered two-story building with a stable yard and cooking fires already burning. Other travelers milled about, leading tired horses and unloading wagons. The innkeeper's wife brought them bowls of hot stew and cornbread. They gathered in the common room, grateful for the warmth of the hearth. But Mateo noticed the sideways glances, the whispered conversations. 2 men near the door wore railroad company badges on their coats. "They're following us," Henry murmured, settling beside Mateo. 3 riders shadowed us since noon." The preacher nodded grimly. "The railroad won't let this pass easy." Mateo watched Ava spooning up her stew, innocent to the danger. His throat tightened. Silently, he prayed for strength to see her through whatever came next. They rose before first light, pressing on through morning fog. By midday, the courthouse rose before them, a stern brick building with white columns and high windows. Mateo helped Ava down from the wagon, steadying her when her legs wobbled from the long ride. Inside, the courtroom smelled of polish and pipe smoke. Their boots echoed on wooden floors as they took their places. The judge, a gray-haired man with keen eyes, studied them from his high bench. Railroad lawyers in fine suits sneered openly when Mateo presented their case. "The girl is clearly confused," one declared. "No proof exists that she is who she claims." "If it please the court," the preacher stood, Bible in hand. "I knew Thomas Whitcomb. He spoke often of ensuring the spring would benefit all, not just the powerful. These papers prove his intent." Henry stepped forward next, his quiet dignity filling the room. "I witnessed the filing of these documents. Thomas Whitcomb trusted me to preserve them, knowing others might try to steal his daughter's birthright." Mateo spoke last, his voice rough with emotion. "Your Honor, I've watched this child survive winter alone, seen her faith shame grown men's doubts. The spring is her legacy. I aim to see she keeps it." Finally, Ava herself rose. Though she barely reached the height of the witness rail, her voice rang clear. "My father said the spring was God's gift, meant to bless everyone. I want to honor his dream, sir. Please help me make it real." The judge examined the filings carefully, turning each page with deliberate attention. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, dust motes dancing in golden beams. At last, he looked up. "This requires careful consideration," he announced. "I will deliver my ruling tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. They found rooms at the hotel across the street. That night, none of them slept much. Mateo paced the floor while Ava curled in an oversized chair, clutching her father's Bible. The preacher prayed softly in the corner. Henry kept watch at the window, his silhouette sharp against the starlit sky. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or heartbreak. For now, they could only wait, and hope, and pray. The courthouse buzzed with tension as morning sunlight streamed through tall windows. Townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder with railroad men in the crowded gallery. Judge Harrison entered, his black robe sweeping as he took his seat. Having reviewed all evidence, the judge's voice rang clear. "I find Thomas Whitcomb's water rights filings to be legal and binding. His daughter Ava, as sole heir, holds rightful claim to the spring. Joy and anger exploded through the room. Deputy Darnell's face twisted with rage. His hand flew to his gun, but Mateo moved faster. One solid punch sent the deputy sprawling, his weapon clattering across the floor. Two lawmen rushed forward, pinning Darnell down. "He's been taking railroad money," someone shouted. "Seen him myself." Ava squeezed Mateo's hand, her face glowing. Henry touched her shoulder gently. "The spirits of your ancestors smile today," he said. "Justice has found its path." That evening, gathered around Mateo's rough table, Ava bowed her head. "Thank you, Lord, for giving us strength, for making us family." Mateo's quiet "Amen" followed, his heart finally at peace. Spring thaw softened the mountain paths as new life stirred in the valley. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the clearing where Ava's cabin once stood. Townsfolk worked side by side, passing logs and raising walls under the warming sun. Mateo watched Ava scampering up ladders with shingles, her laughter mixing with birdsong. As dusk painted the sky purple, lantern light danced across fresh-cut timber. The preacher raised his hands over the completed cabin. "Let this be a house of mercy," he declared, "where all may find welcome." Mateo stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "I aim to adopt Ava proper, make her my daughter-in-law as she already is in my heart." "Pa!" Ava cried, flinging herself into his arms. Tears streaked her dusty cheeks as she held him tight. Henry touched Mateo's shoulder. "You have my word as kin," he said softly. "I'll always be near." Later, beside the crackling fire, Mateo knelt in prayer, gratitude overwhelming him. Ava slept peacefully nearby, while spring water trickled its endless song. The cabin, once broken, now stood as a testament to love restored. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.